I'm here with James Kunstler. James, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to speak with me today.
It's a pleasure.
So, James, where exactly are you right now? And how has the recent pandemic changed the structure of your life and work, if any?
I am in upstate New York, as it's called. I'm about 40 miles northeast of Albany, the capital. I'm about 10 miles as the crow flies from the Vermont state line. I'm in Washington County, New York, which is an agricultural county and has a handful of small towns in it that have become kind of flyover country. They have not been doing well for a long, long time, and but it's very beautiful here, and that's one of the reasons that I'm here. And it also has a population. It has kind of an arty population in the background that takes the rough edge off of the situation. My life has changed not a whole lot since the epidemic started. First of all, I'm an author. I work alone. I live, I commute downstairs to work, so I do not get on a freeway and sit in a car. Tend to lead a very routine life. That the kind of discipline that is necessary to keep pumping books out is something that I've become very conscious of in across my career. So I do maintain regular habits, as Flaubert once said. If you want to be wild in your art, you must be bourgeois in your habits. And so that's what I do. I get up fairly early in the morning usually, and lately I've gotten a lot of correspondence because I wrote a couple of books about the upcoming social and political and economic disorders that we have entered. And because of that, and because it's obvious that we've entered some kind of a probably sustained situation, I'm getting a lot of mail. The first book that I wrote on that subject, which was not my first book at all, was a book called The Long Emergency. And I followed it up with a book in 2012. The Long Emergency came out in 2005. In 2012, I published a book called Too Much Magic, and the subtitle was Wishful Thinking, Technology, and the Fate of the Nation. And I wrote it pretty much just as the USA had entered a sustained period of wishful thinking about how it was going to recover from the disorders of 2008 and 9, which were papered over financially by the Federal Reserve. The problem still remained, and now that we're faced with a much more severe disruption of everyday activities, including new geopolitical friction with other countries that we have that we've synchronized our economy with, namely China, where we're really facing some epical economic problems and changes. But getting back to my situation, around 2011, I bought a property out here in the county because I formerly lived in Saratoga Springs, which is a pretty healthy American Main Street town, about 15 miles east of here. One of the few actually in America that are healthy, for a variety of reasons. It happened to have a mixed economy. It had a private, small 4-year liberal arts college in it, Skidmore College. That helped a lot. It also helped culturally. It was located on a interstate highway between New York and Montreal. And so it got a lot of people coming and going. And it had an historic thoroughbred racetrack that was a huge tourist attraction. And it had some other businesses that were actually going concerns. It had a company that manufactured electronics and radar for the military. It had a sparkling water bottling plant. You know, there are a lot of things going on. So Saratoga was doing pretty well, but after 2001, it kind of got run over by hedge funders who were escaping New York uh, and trying to find a place where their children might be safe. And the property values went way up. So I went looking for something over across the Hudson River on the east side of the Hudson River. And I found a little place I could turn into a homestead. It's 3 acres with a pretty new house on it. And the people who built the house had pretty much crapped out in the 2008, 2009 great financial crisis. They had both been in the commercial construction business, and they went out of business and had to liquidate everything. So I bought this 3-acre place. I immediately went to work building gardens and planted about 30 fruit trees and a lot of berry bushes, and raspberries and blueberries and gooseberries and currants and grapes and more. Got chickens, put up a chicken house. And, you know, the idea was that I'd be able to provide at least some of the food that I eat every year and, you know, be somewhat self-sufficient. It also had the virtue, the place I found had the virtue of being literally on the edge of this small town that I'm in. It's called Greenwich, New York, and it's pronounced Greenwich, not Greenwich. The high school football team is called the Witches. Go figure. Anyway, I'm 11 feet outside the village tax district line. I'm on a strange little property at the end of a little gravel lane right outside the village. So I can walk to Main Street in 11 minutes. And that was something that was important to me because, you know, I had written quite a bit about America's energy predicament, and especially the oil quandary that we faced. And, you know, I knew that sooner or later we were going to have a problem with that. I wanted to be able to walk into town and not be marooned out in the countryside. You know, and that's kind of an interesting feature of American life and of the issues that the new urbanists have been trying to deal with for the last 25 years. And that is, you know, we have arrived in a place in America where we erase the distinction between country life and city and town life, or city life and rural life, so much that people barely even understand the distinction anymore. Basically, you have a lot of people who are living out in the countryside who are leading urban lives in a rural in a rural setting, and that's going to change. You know, one of the things we're going to discuss.
James, sorry to interrupt. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that?
Yes, living
Yeah.
in urban
What
life.
I mean by that is we're going to discover that if you're going to leave, we're going to discover that if you're going to live in a rural place, you better be prepared to do rural activities. You know, that is namely things having to do with working the land, producing food, raising animals, and things like that. It's going to be increasingly difficult to, you know, to lead a virtual working internet life out in the boondocks. And I think that's something people don't realize, that is coming to an end. It's going to really require us to make a much more clear distinction between what are town activities and city activities and what are rural activities. So that whole kind of smear of nebulous development out in the country is going to become increasingly useless. You know, especially all those single family houses on the out parcels that the farmers sold, you know, to raise you know, $20,000 here and there when they, you know, were strapped for funds. So that whole situation is going to change.
In hearing you talk about your experience, and also in light of your extensive publications and thinking about the city, I was curious about what your recent thoughts are now that we are or have been living in confinement, at least in the US, for close to a month now. what are your current thoughts about how this pandemic may influence the future built environment? I think you started touching upon that earlier, but I was curious if you could expand that upon that.
Well, the consequences are going to be enormous, and they'll have as much to do with the economic ramifications of this illness than the illness itself. But although that I think will play a big role in a certain way that I'll get to in a moment. I think really what's going on is this: is that the virus and the sudden withering of the global economy and the shutdown of so many normal activities is going to create problems that won't go away. A lot of activities are going to not work anymore. They're not going to come back. And so we're faced with the task of really reorganizing American life in a comprehensive way. And a lot of it has to do with how we inhabit the landscape. One issue is this: the oil problems that I wrote about in 3 different books were not about running out of oil. They were about the economics of oil and the probability that oil would, in one way or another, not work economically for us anymore. And that's exactly what's going on now. In fact, as we speak, we're in the absolutely insane situation of crude oil prices on the April 20th market being minus $40 a barrel. I mean, no one's ever seen anything like that before. What's happening is that storage capacity is absolutely filled up to the max, and the people who produce oil have absolutely nowhere they can sell it, and nobody can store it anymore. One of the consequences of the virus and the economic and financial disorder is that it's going to make the disutility of suburbia much more obvious, much more quickly. Suburbia is a living arrangement that doesn't have a future. It exists because my new theory of history states that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time.
Some people have thought that this will produce a decentralization of the city, which will rely once again on the automobile and the highway. Are you suggesting that that will not be the case, or?
Yeah, that's a fantasy, and it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen that way at all, because the auto industry is going to collapse. Because that's another feature of the story. Now that, look, we're all of a sudden after 4 weeks, we've got something like 20 to 30% unemployment in America. The American middle class was already in rough shape before this even happened. Okay, the car industry was desperate for customers. Excuse me. They were giving 7-year loans out for used cars, which is absurd because you're underwater after the first 3 or 4 years, and cars can hardly run anymore. They were even so desperate in the fall of 2009. They were so desperate in the fall of 2019 that they were encouraging people who had defaulted on their car loans to come in and get new ones. So here's the deal. The American middle class is no longer credit worthy, and Americans are used to buying cars on credit, and they're not going to get loans. Moreover, as I said a few minutes ago, capital is vanishing at a ferocious rate. The money's not going to be there to give them car loans, even if they qualified for them. So the net effect is that the auto industry is going to shrink, and they are not in a position to, the big automakers have to sell, we sell 17 million cars a year in America. If they can't sell X millions of cars, they're not going to become boutique manufacturers making, 23,000 cars a year. They've got to sell millions of cars. And if they don't sell millions of cars, they're out of business. So that whole interconnected matrix of relationships between the automakers and the oil industry and the highway industry, because the highway industry is going to be starved for money too. We don't know that yet either, but virtually the federal government's bankrupt, functionally bankrupt. Many state governments are functionally bankrupt. Many municipalities are in a ditch financially. There's no money. We're not going to be able to fix this enormous hierarchy of streets, roads, highways, and thoroughfares that we've spent a century constructing. And it's a fantasy to think this is going to happen. But let me get more to the point, okay? The point is, yeah, there are going to be demographic movements. For one thing, the cities are going to be in as much trouble as the suburbs, but for different reasons, okay? The cities are going to lose their tax base. The cities are not going to be able to pay for the services that they need to pay for. There's the routine services. They're not going to be able to pay to maintain their infrastructure. And the cities are going to contract. People are also going to be leaving the cities because they're going to be traumatized by this epidemic, and they're going to be going elsewhere. The trouble is, they're not going to be going to suburbia, because suburbia is going to become completely dysfunctional. Or if they do, it will be some kind of transient or transitional period where suburbia becomes in effect a kind of a social salvage operation, and the property becomes so cheap and degraded that you'll end up with a lot of people squatting in it, or living in it under strange tenancy arrangements, things like that. That might happen for a while. But the real macro mega trend is going to be, people are going to be moving back to small towns and small cities. That's where the action is going to be. The action is going to be in the places that have a meaningful relationship with farming. The places that don't have that are going to be in trouble. There are going to be a lot of places in the American Sun Belt that are not going to make it. Places like Phoenix and Tucson, you can forget about it. People are, they're going to be ghost towns in 20 years. The places that have really unrecognized value in the USA are the places on the inland waterway system, namely the Ohio, Mississippi, Missouri river system, the Hudson River Valley and its connections to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River through the Champlain Canal and the Erie Canal. The Great Lakes themselves are tremendously undervalued because they have not only tremendous amount of fresh water, but they also have some of the best ag land in America. Michigan is a state that has some of the best agricultural land in America. People think that it's just a useless dump, and it's just not true. It's going to be revalued, we have a lot of fantasies right now about running Walt Disney World in suburbia and the U.S. military on alt fuels, but that's not going to happen. We're not going to do that. You can only run a fraction of any of that stuff on alternative energy. And so really what you're looking at is a society that's going to have to downscale severely all of the things that it does, and relocalize all of the things that it does, and rebuild local economic networks and local networks of commerce at a fine grain. People are going to have to get used to employing their neighbors again, instead of depending on giant corporations like Walmart, who siphon all of their wealth out of their locality. And it's going to be a tremendous rebuilding project, and it's not going to be rebuilt at anything near the scale that we know of today. In fact, you can state categorically that anything that's organized at the giant scale, whether it's a commercial network like Walmart or Target, or a giant university, or a giant government, or some giant, global corporation, all of those things are going to wobble and fail.
And
That's probably true, by the way, of most of the centralized school districts in America too. So anything that is built out of scale with the energy and capital realities of the decades ahead is going to fail. And so our assignment is to rebuild things at the correct scale. And the correct scale is the same scale that the new urbanists have been working on for the last 25 years, as far as, you know, how we construct a human habitat on the terrain. Most of America is not prepared for that. Most of the industry that, you know, most of the construction industry as it's known or as it exists today is totally unprepared for that. I mean, you know, they're not even thinking about what happens when you can't get the modular materials that they depend on. You know, people don't even think about something like sheetrock. Sheetrock seems like a really dumb, simple material, you know, just a bunch of gypsum inside cardboard. But guess what? It requires tremendous long distance supply chains for mining and enormous transportation chains. And we're unlikely to have that stuff in the future. I wouldn't bank on it. You know, I wouldn't bet on being able to get a lot of plate glass or getting a lot of aluminum trusses and, you know, all the stuff, the you know, aluminum sashes and the silicon gaskets for those um, plate glass claddings that we put on everything. You know, that stuff's going to be history. And so, you know, we're going to have to be using materials that are a lot simpler than that.
James, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm sorry because our connection has been off. But so what I hear, and I mean, I guess coming to the end of this conversation, what I hear from you is a affirmation of the local and of the and meaning local processes, local food, local materials, and really I don't see any kind of thought that these global networks, which have periodically seemed to have strengthened, right? I mean, we're looking at Amazon and we're looking at retail that's being delivered to every household or many, that these, in your mind, will just be short-term reactions to this recent pandemic, but in the long term, it will be the local that will be really, that will win out, so to speak?
Well, Amazon's an interesting example because it's really got a silly business model when you think about it. You know, the Amazon business model is that every item that they sell makes an individual journey in a truck to its destination. How crazy is that when you're facing, you know, the extinction of the oil industry? It's absurd to imagine that that's going to continue. And in fact, you know, one of the components of what we're facing will probably be the demise of trucking as it has been organized for the last 90 years or so. And, you know, what you're saying is interesting because so many people assume that just because things have worked a certain way for a certain period of time, that of course that guarantees they're going to keep on working. But, you know, there's the famous quote by the economist Herb Stein. You know, he was actually Richard Nixon's head of his economic council, I believe, or he was like, you know, his White House economic advisor. And he famously stated about economics that things go on until they don't. And, you know, that's a lesson we haven't learned. And so we're faced with a situation which is a discontinuity. A discontinuity means you're making a break from things as you have known them, including your own assumptions about, you know, what's going to continue or what's not. So just a lot of things are not going to continue. And, you know, it's not that hard to imagine the task that lies before us. You know, like I said, we got to relocalize, we've got to downscale. It probably means that that there will be a period of disorder, that the journey to that place includes a period of disorder. It's very hard to imagine how bad that disorder may be. I mean, certainly there'll be a lot of economic disorder. We don't know whether people will be fighting over stuff. You know, I think that the the contraction of our giant metroplex cities is going to be pretty unappetizing. You know, it will represent an enormous loss of wealth, and there will be a fight between different groups of people about who gets to occupy the parts of the cities that still retain their value, like the waterfronts and the old cores. But you know, it's really hard to project how much of that disorder, you know, how bad that disorder will be. You know, I think that there's a possibility that our situation will be so difficult that we'll, in effect, will kind of be going medieval for a while. And what we'll see is, you know, a pretty severe timeout from progress as we've come to conceive of it. But you know, that could be an extreme. You know, that's an extreme part of the transect of possibilities.
Well, James, thank you. I think, as always, your thoughts are provocative, and I'm grateful for the time that you spent speaking with me today. And I wish you continued health and well-being, and look forward to the opportunity of being able to continue to converse, at least in the physical world, in the near future.
Yes, thank you, Carie.
Thank you.